Northern Apulia, 73 BCE. Under torchlight and the smell of smoke and olive oil, an entire village was catalogued as spoil, while soldiers marked names on bronze tags and turned lives into entries in a ledger. That night, a handful of women were taken from their cooking fires into the camp tents while a commanding voice barked orders and a drum kept time. When the last document was sealed in an archive chest, nobody outside the Legion would know the full procedure until a ledger and a set of rusted etiquetas bronzadas surfaced in an excavation in 2018. By the end of this video, you will not look at the word conquest in the same way. What follows is drawn from fragmentary testimonies in the archive of a provincial governor, a dossier unearthed in an old hypogeu near the road, reports by a university team, and the recent pericia that dated the labels to the same winter. How much power can a uniform exercise before it becomes a permission to erase? Another question for you to answer as you watch. If this subject unsettles you, like the video now because you will want to see the reconstruction to the end. To understand what happened, we must move from the lane where lanterns still shook to the camp where orders were given and formalized. To understand why this happened, we have to look at the institution behind the boots. The Roman military apparatus operated as a bureaucratic machine as much as a fighting force. Legionary units were allocated resources and human prizes through a tightly enforced protocollo that passed from centurion to tribune to the provincial procurator. Places of detention were not ad hoc. They were institutionalized spaces carved beneath barracks and sometimes beneath temples, where the architecture itself enforced distance between spectacle and secrecy. Contemporary writers and later historians recorded rituals of triumph and the distribution of laurel and rudis to victors, while provincial edicts and senatorial excerpts outlined the rules of all'ocaso. A citation from a preserved senatorial edital in the archive reads in translation that the commander could list non-combatants for reassignment subject to inspection, an arrangement that blurred property law and military custom. Maps recovered near the site show a ludus used for training adjacent to a camp and a narrow road where the village was corralled. You can see in those maps how public glory and private violation shared the same urban logic. The immediate trigger was a skirmish near the stream, a raid that the Legion described later as a punitive conquest. The protagonists on record are a local leader called Aulus, a centurion named Marcus, and a commander, Titus, who arrived to claim the laurel for his cohort. Victory was announced with horns and a formal inscription of ownership. Aulus had mounted a resistance that lasted only a day, but which marked the village for retribution. Rewards were dispensed the next morning in a formal ceremony with an enrollment list, a procedural inscription, and a rudimentary tribunal in the field. The official report mentioned captured women listed as captiva and allocated to the victors as personal property in a way that intertwined military reward with social erasure. The ledger noted nothing of consent, only names, ages, and a line that read all'ocasio to cohort, which hid the human story beneath a bureaucratic euphemism. From the outside, the spectacle looked like triumph. The camp tents were lit, the drums sounded, and soldiers paraded trophies while villagers were paraded in a manner intended to humiliate. The air tasted of ash and roasted grain. The dust of the lane turned to choking clouds under marching feet. Sights included makeshift platforms and bronze labels, clinking the sound of coins, and a soldier laughing that echoed. Sounds included whispered prayers and the scraping of sandals on cobble. Smells were olive smoke, sweat, and urine. Textures ranged from the warm roughness of a woolen mantle to the slick dampness of river clay on bare feet. Emotions were visible in faces flushed with shame, in defiant stares, and in the tremor of hands clutching a cooking pot. In one short reconstructed exchange, a woman named Valeria hissed at a soldier and was shoved aside as the crowd cheered. In the crowd were Decimus, a local merchant, Gaius, a scribe, Aelia, the midwife, Publius, the archivist, and Flavius, a young recruit who would later record what he saw in a faded note. The crucial refusal came in a single moment that split spectacle from consequence. Lucilla, a young mother who had seen the harvest stripped from her family, stood before the tent flap and refused to comply when told to step forward. A silence fell heavier than any drum. Someone moved to push her, someone else hesitated, and someone chose to write it down. The violence that followed was brief but decisive. A physical enforcement of an administrative decision and a moral collapse as witnesses turned away. Her resistance became a fault line between orders and conscience. That silence contained grief and rage. It contained the feel of rope biting into wrists, the sharp smell of candle wax blown out, and the cold press of leather on skin. Later registers would condense that long night into a single line in the ledger, documented and signed, but devoid of sorrow. Beneath the public tents, there were rooms of paperwork and custody zones where the machinery of the state operated in private. The hypogeo was a narrow chamber with stone shelves and clay jars where registers were kept and where commanders filed their reports. The sequence of custody was precise. A scribe named Gaius would copy names onto thin strips. A centurion would add nota, and a procurator would seal the chest with his signet. The chain of command converted people into entries, a process described in an archive note that reads like a protocol. In the dim light of these chambers, the hand that wrote the word captiva hardly trembled. The walls smelled of mildew and candle soot. The stone was cold and smooth. The scrap of papyrus rasped under fingers, and the metallic tang of ink lingered. A ledger found in a provincial archivo included a stamped etichetta bronzata that matched one of the fragments in the excavation, raising the possibility that the same chain of custody survived the centuries. Those private rooms are where procedure became policy, and where a soldier could move from battlefield to administrator with a pen. The decisive encounter took place in one such chamber between Lucilla and Centurion Marcus, and it changed the course of the ledger. The conversation is recorded in a set of fragments and oral memories, and in our reconstruction, it plays like an interrogation that turned into argument. Marcus said, "What is your name?" Lucilla answered, "Lucilla." Marcus said, "Where are you from, Lucilla?" "I am of Cassiola." Marcus, "Why resist now, Lucilla?" "Because I have a child." Marcus, "Who will feed the child?" Lucilla, "My mother will." Marcus, "You understand the new law?" Lucilla, "They took our harvest." Marcus, "The law allows quartering of spoils." Lucilla, "Are women spoils?" "They are designated captiva in the roster." Lucilla, "That makes them numbers." Marcus, "Protocol requires signature." "Whose signature?" Marcus, "The commander's." Lucilla, "So you sign lives?" Marcus, "I sign lists." "Do you not see?" Marcus, "I see orders." "Orders do not always mean justice." Marcus, "The Senado issued the guideline." Lucilla, "The Senado did not stand here when they lifted their skirts." "We follow relics of custom." Lucilla, "Then you follow wrong." "We follow what binds us." Lucilla, "What binds you binds others." "If you refuse, you will be punished." Lucilla, "And if I go with you, what then?" Marcus, "It ends as noted in report." Lucilla, "The report is paper." Marcus, "Paper decides fate." "Paper can also be changed." "That is not for you to decide." "Then it is for history to decide." "History is slow." "But it remembers." After that exchange, Marcus signed his name in the ledger, and Lucilla was moved to the tent sector marked for allocation. The dialogue shows a soldier constrained by protocolo and a woman who refused to collapse into anonymity. In Marcus' background, there was a rudis awarded in the last campaign, and letters from a brother in Rome promising advancement. He had been a teacher once in a ludus and learned to read. Those details complicated his choice. In Lucilla's background, she had known drought and the funeral of her father when she was 12. She had worked the field beside Aelia, the midwife, and once traded a necklace to pay taxes. That backstory explains why she resisted, and why she could not accept being turned into an entry in a ledger. The aftermath was bureaucratic and almost clinical.
Records show transfers, a form of relabeling that moved names between cohorts, a medical note by a field medic, and a
sealed communication to the provincial tribunal. A fictionalized reading of the protocol shows a stamped line that reads "Allo caso," with a hand that sealed the fate. The infirmary had beds with straw, the taste of vinegar, and the clink of metal bowls. Some women developed fevers, some lost their ability to work, and at least one name appears later in a death register under causes marked avoidable. The official tone is dispassionate, but the annotations in the margin hint at panic at the loss of labor and at the faint recognition that an economy had been rebalanced by violence. Officials debated whether to annotate the ledger and whether to allow the village to continue receiving traders. The ledger entries were cross-referenced with a ship manifest and with lists sent to the neighboring province proving that the system distributed people as efficiently as grain. Public reaction reached the provincial capital when Publius, the archivist, leaked a copy of the night ledger to a senator sympathetic to humanitarian concerns. The Senato debated whether to censure the commander and whether to tighten rules around captiva and allocaso. Two factions emerged, one pragmatic that argued the stability of supply routes, and one moral that argued for legal protection of non-combatants. Speeches survived in fragmentary form. A quote attributed to a procurator warned against undermining discipline, while another voice called for parricius and for the opening of archives. Newspapers in the city of the time wrote of procedimentos cloaked in necessity, while a few outspoken magistrates demanded tribunal review. The political push and pull reveals how institutions absorb or correct abuses when documents force them to reckon with practice. Modern evidence confirmed much of this reconstruction. The excavation of 2018 unearthed a hypogeo of stone shelves labeled with tags and a sealed chest containing strips of papyrus. Parrhesia Laboratories dated the ink and the bronze etiquetas to the winter of 73 BCE, and carbon samples from a wooden box matched the record in the archive. University teams published notes linking the physical items with the ledger transcription that Publius had preserved. Archaeologists described the camp layout, the proximity of a ludus, the road used for removal, and the locus where the public spectacle took place. The finds proved that the administrative language in the ledger corresponded to material practice. Photographs show the mildew on the stone, the rust on the bronze, and the rough cord used to bind the registers. Those artifacts took the story from oral memory to evidentiary chain and forced historians to confront the architecture that made erasure possible. Tension Moment 1. The first moment of tension was the silence that fell when Lucilla refused to step forward. In that pause, 1,000 decisions were compressed. The feel of a soldier's breath close to her face, the grit of ash on her tongue, the cold metal of an etiquetta slid across a palm, the scrape of papyrus as Gaius tried to keep pace, and the low ripple of the crowd deciding whether to look away. In those seconds, an entire moral economy was on trial, and the village held its breath. Tension Moment 2. The second moment of tension occurred in the hypogeo when the chest was sealed. Hands hesitated over the wax, the candle smoke curled and tasted acrid on the tongue, and a seal left an imprint like a scar. The small sound of the seal hitting the wood echoed like a verdict. Outside, a drum rolled like distant thunder, and within the chamber, the archivist, Publius, felt the weight of the responsibility to name what could not be unnamed. Tension Moment 3. The third moment came when the Senato received a copy of the ledger. Senate halls smelled of oil and old paper, the sun cut through high windows, and dust trembled in the rays. Arguments rose and fell. A procurator pounded a table. The voice of a moralist trembled, and the ledger sat between them like a mute witness. Decisions made there would shape policy for the provinces, and yet none could restore lives already taken. The backstory of Lucilla requires detail to understand why her refusal mattered. She had been born in the village to a family of smallholders and learned to read rudimentary marks from her grandfather when he kept accounts of seed and sheep. Her childhood was punctuated by death. Her mother died when Lucilla was 9, and a brother was conscripted into a local militia the same year. She married a craftsman who later drowned in a flash flood, and she spent winters trading olive oil and sowing barley while teaching a neighbor boy to write in exchange for salt. The day before the Legion arrived, she had argued with a tax collector over a levy and had burned a small letter that hinted at an unfair assessment. Over time, she became a familiar presence at Alia, the midwife's doorway, and she once saved a child from choking on bread. These layers of loss, labor, memory, and small acts of courage explain why she stood when others stepped back. This backstory shows a life built of routine and care, a life that a ledger could not represent. A month after the events, the village was quieter. Markets had less produce. The stores smelled more of dried figs, and the sound of children at play had diminished. Traders approached with caution, and many villagers wore the pallor of fatigue. Lucilla was missing from the morning hearths, and a rumor ran that she had been transferred. A petition circulated calling for inquiry, but it reached only a small number of hands. The labels and a copy of the ledger were shown in a public space, and people murmured at the familiarity of words like captiva that had been used to justify action. Some families began to record their own registers of loss as a protective measure. 3 months later, a formal complaint arrived at the provincial tribunal. The Senado had requested a paresia. The change is ending. Lab results were published showing the correspondence of ink and bronze. The debate in the capital hardened into a policy review, and for the first time the word allocación was debated in public, with nuance. A few commanders were chastised and one received a formal reprimand, but no major reform was yet enacted. The village tried to recover trade relationships, and slowly old routines began to resume, while the memory of that night lingered in whispered stories and in the smell of smoke on winter mornings. Publius published his account with caution. Elia collected oral testimonies and kept them in a jar that she labeled on a scrap of papyrus. 6 months after the ledger surfaced, more profound changes were visible. A small commission convened to examine the rules of quartering and to recommend safeguards for non-combatants. The Senado published a set of guidelines that clarified some uses of the protocol and demanded more rigorous documentation and oversight. Archivists were instructed to create duplicate entries and to stamp ledgers with unique markers. Local magistrates were told to oversee transfers and to allow women a process to register objections. These changes did not erase what had happened, but they changed the framework by which a future action could be judged. The excavation report remained a touchstone. Scholars cited it in lectures, and a fundraising campaign paid for conservation of the Hypogeo items. The village rebuilt slowly, stone by stone, while conversations about power and responsibility circulated in the city and in private homes. The moral of this history is not a neat condemnation of individuals alone, but a critique of systems that make violence administratively possible. The cataloging of human lives in ledgers and the use of protocolo to rationalize harm are not relics locked in the past. We have seen how architecture, ritual, language, and law combine to produce outcomes that look inevitable when viewed as procedure. The artifacts, the etiquetas gronzadas, the ledger, and the hypogeo give us evidence that allows judgment and that demands action. So ask yourself, what practices today hide behind bureaucratic language and who pays the cost? A final reflection comes from the fragments themselves, which insist that naming matters and that records have consequences. If this story troubled you, tell us in the comments. Would you have resisted like Lucilla or negotiated like others? Write resistilia or negociaria and one sentence why. Your perspective helps shape future investigations. If you want more investigations that open archives, show pericias, and connect ruins to policy, subscribe to the channel to follow the next episodes where we will open new files and speak with experts about how institutions can be reformed. Remember, names are not just entries, and history is not only what was recorded.